Hello, Blazers. Welcome to episode 67 of UAB Green and Told. Original release date Monday, March 14th, 2022. This podcast allows us the chance to share stories from members of the UAB community. Want to listen into previous episodes of the podcast? Visit alumni.uab.edu/greenandtold or look us up on Spotify and the Apple Podcast app. While there, leave a written review so more alumni can find us. I'm Greg Berry, a UAB alum and assistant director in the UAB Office of Alumni Affairs. It's amazing how a career path can change. For today's guest, his pivoted sharply as he was winding down his undergraduate degree. Rafael Andino thought he knew what his future held. As he'll share, his fascination of cars was all set to culminate with a career at GM.
And I remember looking at one of them when he told me this the first time, and I said, "You've got to be crazy. I have no interest at all in the field of medicine and the human body. I don't know how it works. I don't really care for it. It just doesn't seem like something I'd want to do."
But Rafael kicked a career with cars to the curb and found himself in a new field, biomedical engineering, one that was basically writing itself when he was in class.
All of the courses were just beginning. In other words, there was very few, if any, textbooks.
Plus, at a point in life when members of the military may be mulling retirement, he made the leap to sign up.
At this point, I'm in my late 30s. Which is way past when most people get recruited in to serve. And I said, well, I was 36, 37, something like that.
Born in Havana, Cuba to immigrant parents, Rafael Andino moved to South Texas as a 3-year-old in the mid-60s. From there, his family would settle in South Florida. While his grandfather was an architect and professor at New York's Columbia University, you can say that Rafael's thirst of curiosity also helped lead him down his path into engineering.
So I was one of these kids that was always curious on how things worked and why they worked and what's going on inside this TV or what's going on inside this car engine or what's going on, why do things work the way they do? Whatever it was, a vacuum cleaner, it didn't matter. I was always curious, and I still am to this day, on why things work and how things work in the physical world, right? The fact that all of these things that we surround ourselves with, including the fact that we can do this long distance communication now over the internet, to me blows my mind. So all these things have always been fascinating to me as a kid growing up. And again, I was fortunate in that I was surrounded by several people in my life that had also technical backgrounds, and they kind of fostered that, right? So I had an uncle, I mentioned my grandfather, I had, this will sound funny, but my neighbor across the street, he was this amazing man who was also an immigrant from Italy, served in World War II. He's an Italian American. He had a woodworking shop in the back of his house that he built. And the house that I grew up in South Florida, he actually built. And so I would spend so much time in his woodworking shop watching him work and just with basic tools, right? Just hammers, screwdrivers, but he had some saws, he had a little drill press, he had a circular saw, things that I thought as a little kid, I thought were really interesting. And so believe it or not, that really influenced me because I saw how you could build things, And so as a little kid, if you're surrounded by that, and if you have this crazy little mind that's always wondering why and how things work, you end up gravitating to something like engineering. We have on my mother's side of the family a lot of architects, and I had thought, well, maybe I'll be an architect because it just seemed like to be the family trade. But my grandfather actually talked me out of that. He said, no, you should study engineering for a variety of reasons. Architecture is not really a very predictable field. Sometimes, architects do well if the economy is doing well, where you're practicing, other times they don't. But engineering is is a more predictable field where you can earn a living and that sort of thing. And so, of course, I didn't know what that meant. But boy, now at this point in my life, was he ever right? I know because I have several architect friends, he was absolutely right on the button with that. And it was really helpful. And it continued on through Georgia Tech, and is really the reason that I made it to UAB, in fact. So
let's talk a little bit about that, because you did graduate from Georgia Tech with mechanical engineering degree.
Right.
When you attended UAB, you're going after a biomedical engineering degree. What was the transformation? What was the transition between Georgia Tech and UAB, and why the change?
Probably around my junior year at Georgia Tech, I had been set on I'm going to work in the automotive industry. In fact, I still love cars to this day. I'm a big car guy. And so I was going to go work for either Ford or GM, one of the big three, Chrysler, and one of those companies. In fact, I already had a job offer as a junior with General Motors up in, I even remember the town, Ypsilanti, Michigan, designing transmissions. And that may sound boring, but for a diehard car guy that's a mechanical engineering major, designing transmissions is really cool because transmissions are very complex pieces of machinery. So around that time, I had two professors at Georgia Tech that were my mentors, and they took me under their wing, and they convinced me that I should consider learning more about applications of engineering and medicine. And I remember looking at one of them when he told me this the first time, and I said, "You've got to be crazy. I have no interest at all in the field of medicine and the human body. I don't know how it works. I don't really care for it. It just doesn't seem like something I'd want to do. Plus, look, I already have a job with General Motors, and this is what I've wanted to do my whole life since I was a little kid. So how could you tell me not to pursue this? I mean, to me, it's, that was my version of the American dream, especially as a little immigrant kid. So anyway, but he was a very smart man, and like my grandfather, I kind of put him on the same plane there. I would listen to him because I realized, in fact, he was one of the founders of the field of biomedical engineering. And so I listened to Professor Narum, and he said, "Why don't you audit a class over at Emory, down the street here in Atlanta, in physiology, just audit a physiology class." And I said, "I don't even know how to spell physiology. How do you, what is that?" And so anyway, so I listened to him, and I did. I sat in the back of the room, I audited his physiology, and actually I really liked it. And I came back to him, and I said, "Look, I didn't realize the human body is kind of like a machine. It's got all these parts and pieces, and they work together. All these systems, all these organ systems work together." And kind of I was thinking about it like that, right? Like a machine, because that was my background. And so little by little, they drew me, both of these gentlemen drew me into this really brand new field, because this would have been the mid 80s. It didn't really exist yet in the United States formally. There was a few graduate programs offered. There was no undergraduate training in the field of biomedical engineering in the 80s. And Georgia Tech at the time was just starting to think about putting a program together. And in fact, I later learned that I was probably one of the guinea pigs students that signed up to take some of these very early classes in bioengineering that they were offering. So as a senior, what I did was all the electives that I was allowed to take at Tech, I took in this new field of bioengineering. And it was literally these classes with maybe 3, 4, 5 students, just the other guys that got roped into, taking these classes. And so I really enjoyed it. I graduated, obviously with a mechanical engineering degree, but a concentration in bioengineering. I remember my last few classes, they came to me and he says, "Well, you know what you have to do now?" And I said, "No, what?" He says, "You have to go to graduate school, because you've just scratched the surface of this new field." And I said, "Well, then I guess I got to turn down my job at GM, because my whole career changed, right?" So I went from wanting to work in the auto industry to now all of a sudden getting into this new field. And it was scary because I had no idea what I was going to do now. I had my whole career path mapped out, so I thought. And now all of a sudden these guys turned me on to this new thing. And I had no idea where I could get a job. I didn't know anything about the industry. I didn't know anything about what companies were in there. I didn't know what I would do. And so under that kind of environment, I started looking for graduate schools. And there wasn't that many. There was a few. And I remember applying to a few others in addition to UAB. But UAB had always had a good reputation. I did some research in medicine, obviously, and their medical school's always been top notch. And so I remember going to visit, and I really liked it. I liked Birmingham. I liked the town. I liked the school. met with a few people. And again, it was very early days. You know, they were the graduate program there. There was no undergraduate program, but they were just starting off with the graduate program. And so that's how I ended up at UAB. I applied, I got accepted. I got accepted to a few other programs, but I'm really glad I came to UAB. It's worked out pretty well since.
You turned down the job in Ypsilanti, Michigan, frigid Midwest state, and you go to UAB to study biomedical engineering. At the time, it's young, it's a burgeoning kind of academic experience. What were your initial impressions on the coursework, on the program as you got involved at UAB?
First, I thought, what in the world did I get myself into? So one of the more interesting things was that all of the courses were just beginning. In other words, there was very few, if any, textbooks, right? And so the professors that were teaching us from articles, journal articles that they had read, their own experiences, research that they had done. And so I really didn't have textbooks per se for many of the courses, with the exception of the more formal courses. For example, we had to take formally physiology and anatomy, and I remember histology and some things. And for those classes, oftentimes they would combine us with the students in the medical school, which also, when I would be sitting in one of these classes, I would think to myself, what in the world am I doing sitting here with medical students, learning about, how the kidney functions or whatever it was. And so for those classes, we had books because we simply bought the books that they would sell you in medical school. So it was just a bizarre kind of change in pace, and eventually I got used to it, and I really enjoyed it. And to this day, it was probably one of the smartest decisions that I have to say that I made, but it wasn't because of me, as I told you. It was because I listened to these professors that really could see the future of medical of medicine and medical product development and in our country and in the world, and had the vision to see that. And I was so fortunate to meet them and to be in the right place at the right time and to get pointed in this direction.
Originally, when you had the job at GM working on transmissions that you ultimately turned down, you're going to be working with your hands. You're going to be doing a little bit more designing. What was kind of the end goal with your biomedical degree coming out of UAB?
Unbeknownst to me at the time, it ends up that I still ended up working with my hands. So everything that I loved doing as a kid, from working in my neighbor's workshop to everything I told you, it ends up that in this field, you end up using your hands quite a bit. In fact, to this day, I still participate in studies in the lab and in vivo studies, preclinical studies that we do, and it's all done with a hands-on kind of approach. My interest in doing this didn't go away. In fact, it's been more and more prevalent in my career as I've moved through different jobs and different companies and started companies and all of that. The hands-on approach has always been part of that. So it's been good in that regard. During
this entire time that you're at UAB, you also entered the Army. Did you ever see yourself having kind of a military career while you're doing this engineering stuff too?
No, my career path, as I've told you before, I don't really recommend it for anyone because it's been quite an interesting and crazy thing. No, so I entered the Army while I was starting UAB. I was a cadet, in fact, in ROTC, and my thought was I would get a research job at one of the premier Army biomedical research laboratories. And so my plan was to get my commission as a second lieutenant and get my degree from UAB, and with those two things in hand, become a research scientist or research engineer at Walter Reed. And that was the original plan. But again, anytime you come up with a plan, much like my plan to go work at General Motors, that did not work out the way I thought. Yeah, that was crazy because again, the timing was not good. So what happened was that this was the late 80s. So this was 1988, 1989. Everyone might remember during that time period, we had this fellow named Saddam Hussein who decided to invade a little country in the Middle East called Kuwait. And so the army was mobilized to liberate Kuwait. President Bush at the time was determined to do that, and we did do that successfully. And so I had an option to either stay in school and finish my graduate studies, or to get my commission and join the rest of the guys that I had trained with and go liberate Kuwait. It was a really hard choice, I have to say. It's probably one of the most difficult choices I've made in my life. So I decided to stay in school instead of getting my commission. And so I left the Army. And so there went my whole career plan of going to Walter Reed. That fell through. And I wasn't able to do that. And so I stayed in school, got my degree from UAB, and then ended up going into industry.
At that point, it's not the end of the military career, and we'll circle back here in a little
Right.
bit to that. You enter the working world. You work for C.R. Bard, CIBA Vision. You founded a company, Biophysica, and then you went back to C.R. Bard. So you're doing all of these different things. Talk just a little bit about the experiences at all these companies that you worked at and founded.
Right. Yeah. So I entered into industry in the early 90s, and you're right, I worked in all these different companies, and it was really a tremendous learning opportunity for me, and an opportunity to really generate ideas and generate products for unmet medical needs. And so at Bard, I had the ability to work in all kinds of fields: urology, gynecology, cardiovascular medicine. At CIBA Vision it was an ophthalmic company, ophthalmology. So that was part of the big pharmaceutical firm, Novartis. And so I was exposed to big pharma, which would later help me in future career options. I met a lot of people. And the thing that was really important in all these experiences was, obviously the projects you work on and the products that you're able to launch. And I've been fortunate to launch, dozens of products into markets around the world in this time. But really more importantly, I think for me, were the people that I would meet. So either folks that I would have the opportunity to hire and mentor, or people that I would work for that would be my mentors and that would guide my career and offer me other career opportunities. And so oftentimes in industry, like in many aspects of life, including the military, is the same thing. When you meet someone that you really enjoy working with and you work well together, and that person moves on to another opportunity, oftentimes they'll carry you along with them, or you carry them along with you. And I've had that experience where this is amazing for me to be able to say this, but I've never really been in a position where I had to look for employment. In fact, what's happened every time that I've moved and made a career change, folks would find me, people perhaps that have worked with me before, or that worked for me, or where I worked for them, and just really offer me, different chances to do different things. And so that's how I've been able to have such a broad exposure to so many areas of medicine, of medical product development, and really my last 10 years almost in pharmaceutical development. So I've worked in both devices and on drugs over the course of over 30-year career now. And again, it all started with this UAB education and exposure to this field.
And after about a decade, not quite a decade and a half, you returned to the military with the U.S. Air Force Reserve. At this point, you're more experienced. Let's face it, you're older. So right. Why the decision to get back into it, and why the Air Force?
Working with all these interesting people over the years, I happened to have met someone at Novartis who, in fact, was an optometrist, and he was a very similar career path to me. Started off in the Army, left the Army, and then joined the Air Force in the Reserve. he and I became friends and would work together. And in fact, we would run together at lunch. And so, he told me, he says, why don't you consider getting back into the service? And I said, well, at this point, I'm in my late 30s, which is way past when most people get recruited in to serve. And I said, well, I was, I think 36, 37, something like that. And I said, well, I'm too old. And plus, I don't know if my family would support it. And he said, well, why don't you look into that? And I said, all right. So I managed to convince my wife this would be a good thing. And my wife has always been tremendously supportive, I have to say, in all these things that I've done. So she's been tremendous. So she encouraged me to look into it. And so we did. So it took a couple years. So this is right before 9/11. And the Air Force said, well, you have some interesting background. You have this medical background. And then at the time, I had already earned a business degree, an MBA, and you have this business degree. And so you would make a good administrator in our medical system. And I said, okay, so what can I do? And they said, well, it turns out that both the Army and the Air Force have a corps called the Medical Service Corps. And these people are medical administrators, and they know enough about medicine to be able to work with physicians and nurses and med techs, but they have administration skills so they can run things like hospitals and squadrons and flights and things like that. So they're naturally organized, kind of administratively leaning people. And so that's what happened. So they offered me this opportunity to come back in, and I did. So they commissioned me as a captain, which is nice because I had already earned some time in. And so that was now about 20 years ago. So after this long break in service, as you pointed out, I was able to get back in and then have two careers. So I had my professional career in industry, and now all of a sudden I would have a military career in the Air Force. And so that's how that happened.
With all the experience that you have had, private industry, military, all of that, how did UAB establish kind of the core for you for success?
So I think UAB instilled in me just a love and a passion for this industry, for what I would call the biomedical or biotech industry. Everything that I learned and everyone that I was exposed to at UAB was really passionate in this field. The idea that you could identify a disease or the need for a therapeutic, to be able to diagnose or a disease, and the fact that you can fix that you can make it better. The idea that as human beings, we can use our skills and what we've learned collectively as a society, as a species, and solve medical problems. All of that came from UAB, from my exposure at UAB and my exposure to the amazing people, the faculty, and the folks at UAB. So that's number one. And I think the second thing that I think people need to realize about the UAB is the accessibility that you have to the great hospitals there on campus. This is something that very few universities, now that I know most of the BME programs in the country and in the world I've had exposure to, there are very few universities where you have in such close proximity to a world-class medical school, with world-class researchers. There are a few in the country that are like that, but not that many. And to have been part of that, to have the ability to put on a white lab coat and walk into the halls of any of the hospitals there at UAB and to work with physicians and nurses and researchers, that was really invaluable, for me, and it taught me how to interact with medical professionals. So it was a lot of good stuff that came out of my, I'd say probably almost 4 years, over 3 years that I was there.
How cool was it to be kind of on the ground floor of the BME industry?
Yeah, that was very cool. Being able to meet some of the founding fathers of this discipline was super cool, and some are still around. And being able to go into industry and be one of the first. In fact, when I was hired at CR Bard, which is now part of Becton Dickinson, a very large medical conglomerate, I was the first biomedical engineer they had ever hired. They didn't know what to make of me. Well, what are you supposed to do? Like, are you more of a doctor? Are you more of an engineer? What projects do we give you? And I credit the person that hired me for taking a chance. He was actually a mechanical engineer, and he took a chance on hiring me because it was a new species, right? They didn't know what to make of us. And so after that, then of course, the doors kind of swung open and this became a common thing. But yeah, to be the first BME any place. And it was fun. It was fun in the 90s to move around and to be the first and to show people what biomedical engineers can do.
That's Rafael Andino. Rafael earned a Master of Science in Biomedical Engineering from the School of Engineering in 1991. Currently, he's Colonel and Commanding Officer with the 94th Aeromedical Staging Squadron at Dobbins Air Reserve Base in Georgia and Vice President of Engineering and Manufacturing with Clearside Biomedical. While his academic career took him to multiple schools in the Southeast, Rafael definitely has an idea of what it means to be a blazer.
To me, a blazer, I look at it as part of being a trailblazer. Again, I've had the great privilege to be able to do in my career to blaze new trails in anything that I've done. As an immigrant kid, as one of the first biomedical engineers coming out of the program at UAB, working in companies, starting companies, and then my military experience. I'm probably one of the few, medical commanders that, in fact, I'm probably the only one that is a biomedical engineer currently in the medical service of the Air Force. So, in all these things, I felt like I've had the opportunity to be a trailblazer. So, for me, blazers is really synonymous with being a trailblazer.
Be sure to listen into previous episodes of UAB Green and Told. You can find all of them at alumni.uab.edu/greenandtold. Have a story to share? Email greenandtold@uab.edu. Finally, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search UAB Alumni. Thanks for listening, and until next time, go Blazers.